Remotely today from Bloomington is Tanda Radon. She is a coordinator of the Housing and Eviction Prevention Project in Monroe County, which provides free legal assistance to Monroe County tenants facing eviction and landlords navigating the eviction process without attorneys. The project also provides mediation and housing social services referrals to those in need. She refers folks in addition to that to temporary shelters in the county if they are at risk for eviction as well. So welcome to you all. Tanda, thank you so much for joining us remotely. And to our guests, thank you again for joining us. I'd like to start off today by discussing briefly, and Fran, I would love it if you could address this initially, but certainly our other guests are welcome to chime in. I would love to talk about where we are as a state in terms of evictions, how we got to where we are, some of those factors that are at play, where we are in terms of our eviction crisis and the numbers of folks who face eviction here in the state.
Sure. Thank you, Ruby, for inviting me. So obviously the core of eviction problems, and I know we'll talk about that, is people can't afford housing, right? That they can't afford housing because they have economic struggles, because affordable housing is so hard to come by. We don't have enough subsidies for folks who can't afford market rate housing. I know we'll talk about that, but that's happening all around the country. But Indiana, even before the pandemic, led the nation in terms of how many people were thrown out of their homes. So what makes Indiana different? Because that kind of struggle is happening here, but it's also happening to other places. And I think that comes down to it in large part because our eviction process here in Indiana, we make evictions fast, we make them cheap, and we make them easy. And it becomes a first resort for landlords instead of a last resort, which in many, many other places around the country, it's much more difficult. So consider the cheap part. Here in Marion County, a landlord has to pay only $107 and fill in the blanks on a form that maybe takes 5 minutes to do. They plunk it down, and then immediately the tenant has what's called a Scarlet E, an eviction filing on their record that makes it really hard for them to find a new place to go. We have tenants right now who are our clients who are trying to find new places to live, and the fact that there's an eviction filing, even if it didn't result in an end result judgment of eviction, makes it hard for them to find a place to go. We make it really fast. People know that the court system moves really slow, the legal system moves slow. As a lawyer, you're constantly explaining that to people. Not evictions. Evictions move really hyper fast here in Indiana. It can be as quick as 10 days from the time the tenant gets a notice, and sometimes not much more than that. Other places around the country, it takes a lot longer. It gives the tenant time to catch up. It gives them time to find a new place to be, kind of catch up on rent, etc. No, we move it really fast. And we make it easy. Those initial hearings, the first time a tenant goes to court, in most Indiana courts, they don't have much they can say in defense if they're behind on rent. Most Indiana judges will cut them off there, won't let them talk about the poor conditions. Just came from court this afternoon. Tenants were showing on the form, on their phone, these pictures of horrible mold, horrible leaks, flooding, sinks stopped up, etc. In most Indiana courts, we think that's wrong, but most judges won't let that kind of defense be presented. So very quick and easy, a landlord's able to get quote-unquote possession, which means a family is displaced. Indiana does that faster, cheaper, and easier for landlords than any other place. So it's really no surprise that the result is that we have these evictions happening so fast. A Notre Dame law professor did a study and went and looked at a lot of court hearings. The average time for a court hearing, 2 to 3 minutes for somebody to lose their home. Chief Justice Rush of our Indiana Supreme Court went to the courts and found 250 consecutive cases. Tenants didn't have a lawyer at all. So it's really easy for a landlord to kick somebody out in Indiana. Our court system makes that happen.
Thank you so much for that, Fran. Stephanie, I know that from your perspective, can you talk about the role of low wages and the heavy rent burden that folks face here in Indianapolis, and how that might have contributed to your own eviction, but also how that might contribute to the eviction of some of the women that you might help to serve?
Oh, yes. So once again, thank you, Ruby, for having me. My experience has been there are a lot of women who work hard, and they work hard 40 hours a week, but still aren't able to make that payment. And what is happening is a lot of us are taking on even more stressful roles, trying to get our kids into places they need to be. And I think a lot of it definitely starts with the living wage. I believe that when we all need to be paid what we're worth. And for a woman to single mom, evicted twice. And they were in my earlier years, but I still see those issues and those problems 25, 30 years later, where we are struggling as a Black mom to try to make ends meet and getting evicted. I was very fortunate that I did have someone I could stay with after that, but I look at the struggles now, and where will they go? What will happen to them? What is a solution so that we can get people into housing? And I've worked with some others to try to come up with some ideas, and I have some ideas of my own, which we'll share later.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And Fran, thank you. I wanted to talk to Tonda for a moment as well, because one of the things Fran talked about, Tonda, is how it's fast, cheap, and easy for landlords here to evict folks. I'm wondering how you're finding those factors playing out in Monroe County. Are there similarities? Are there differences?
I would agree. I think that part of the reason, or part of what Fran was sharing, is it really is not just, it's happening all over. I mean, this isn't something that's new. I think that with the pandemic, it's exacerbated an issue that's been there kind of underlying for a long time. What we're seeing here in Monroe County is it is fast, and there isn't a lot of time that's spent in the courtroom on these cases. We have 2 judges that are in our small claims court evictions, and so on a Thursday afternoon in court 4, there are 3 hearings scheduled every 15 minutes. And so even though our project is able to provide free legal advice to those tenants and pro se landlords that want it, that time frame for advice is usually 3 or 4 minutes. And that is, I'm grateful that we can be there and we can provide that service to the tenants, but 3-4 minutes isn't really enough time to address a legal question, a legal issue, and provide any type of legal argument for that tenant whose household is, or whose housing is being jeopardized. One thing that we're seeing that has been somewhat successful is we have the option for mediation. We also have mediators through the Community Justice and Mediation Center that are there and available to help the landlord and the tenant come to some type of resolution if they're interested. And a lot of that time is spent on a voluntary surrender agreement. And so, yes, you may not have that Scarlet E eviction. That decision ends up being you'd like to say voluntary. It doesn't feel very voluntary, I think, for the tenant that no longer is able to stay in their housing. But the end result is the same. They have to be out within a certain number of days. Our judges in Monroe County, typically it's 10 days to 14 days, depending on the circumstances, but it is still very quick. From the time that hearing can happen to the time where you need to be out, 10 days, 14 days.
And let me ask you as well, Tonda, you mentioned previously that there in where you are, perhaps the population of folks, there's students and whatnot who are being impacted by the eviction crisis. So can you talk a little bit about the population of folks that are most heavily impacted there?
Sure. And so we are a college town. Indiana University is here. Similar to many other university towns, it's a higher percentage of rentals. And so the city of Bloomington itself in Monroe County is 65% of it is rental. And there really isn't a very high vacancy rate. I was looking at some information to prepare for this and talking to the City of Bloomington's hand department, and we're looking at 96% of filled. And so most of the time after a court hearing, when I'm talking to people, they might have a Section 8 voucher, and they have been looking for someone to accept that voucher for 6 months. They might have lost that opportunity to use that use that voucher because they're not able to find someone that will accept it because the market rate is so much higher. There isn't a very large incentive for a landlord to accept a housing voucher when they can make a lot more money on the market for a population where there just isn't other housing. I think what's interesting also, and I believe it was Stephanie that mentioned this, is when we talk about the wages and low wages, I was looking at the Out of Reach Indiana report, and so for a Hoosier, someone living in Indiana, they need to earn $16.57 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom rental home without being cost burdened. So without spending more than 30% of their income. That would be what you would need to earn in order to afford that, $16.57. However, the median wage is $14.58. So in Monroe County, that's about $1.50 more, where in order to afford that same equivalent house, you have to be making almost $18 an hour. And those of us in the workforce know that those jobs and those pay rates aren't there. So you're already behind because you're not able to make that wage. It's very competitive housing market, and many times when somebody is evicted, there are already 2 or 3 people waiting to hopefully be the lucky one to rent that apartment. So it just seems like we have some unique challenges, or maybe not unique to other college towns, but that's who I'm talking to, people that can't find housing and they've been looking 4 months, 6 months, a year to find something that they can afford.
Understood. One of the interesting things that Tonda mentioned was regarding the Section 8 vouchers. Refresh my memory, Fran, they are not required are landlords not required here to take Section 8 vouchers, or is there a stipulation that you're aware of in law concerning those, or even you, Tonda, if you might know?
Sure, the landlords are not required to take it. We don't have a different kind of challenge in our housing market here. The bigger challenge we see, to be honest, is that almost every one of the tenants we work with would qualify for a housing voucher, but they don't get them. There's a huge waiting list, sometimes many years long. Across the country, 3 out of every 4 families who would qualify for these housing vouchers or subsidized housing in one way or another, which would frankly allow folks to stay in their homes and not risk homelessness and not be, we have clients who are sleeping in their cars, sleeping in garden sheds, etc. That wouldn't happen if they could get a voucher, but they can't because we don't prioritize that in our policy. We don't make those vouchers available for 75% of the people who are eligible financially. And that would just really solve a lot of the problems, but it's not something that our policymakers have prioritized.
Now, I do want to follow up on something that you just said about where certain folks are sleeping. Those are literal places where you're finding that folks are sleeping? Was that just a bit of hyperbole?
No, that's our clients. We have folks who cannot afford a place to stay. To Stephanie's point, and I know Tonda mentioned it too, they just simply don't have enough income to pay their rent. So sometimes they're paying 60%, 70%, 80% of their income for rent, and they can make that work for a while, but then a kid gets sick, or somebody has to stay home from school, or a car breaks down and they can't get to the job and they miss some days, and things fall behind, and that very precarious balancing act they've been involved in that falls apart. They fall behind on their rent and they get evicted. We've got something like 80,000 people, last I saw, 80,000 households across the state of Indiana who are behind on their rent right now. Of course, the pandemic some people may think it's over. It's not over for folks who are struggling to make ends meet, struggling to keep their kids in school so they can go to work, struggling to find childcare, themselves staying healthy, their loved ones, sometimes elderly relatives staying healthy. All those kind of things put people behind. To Stephanie's point, they just don't make enough money to afford market rate rent, and these housing vouchers just really aren't available for almost any of the people we're talking with.
So let me follow up and ask you this, Fran, concerning the state's eviction diversion program, where they just approved one in court for the courts here. That is voluntary for both the landlord and the tenants. Can you share a bit about how you think that might be able to help to divert some of those cases before they get to eviction court, and hopefully be able to mediate those?
Right. Well, I I would love to be optimistic about that diversion program. I think that what its goals are exactly right. It's press pause. Let's wait 90 days while people have a chance to get this emergency rental assistance in the door, have the eviction records sealed so they don't have the trouble finding a new place to be. The problem is it's not mandatory. And landlords already, we've already talked about it, the court system works so well for their interests now that they're going to be asked to agree to that. I don't see that happening very much given what we see in the courts. And if it's not mandatory, if landlords can just go ahead and do what they've continued to do and throw people out quickly in order to turn it over and get a new tenant who will pay more, that kind of thing, or sell the home, whatever, I just don't think that's going to make a big difference. The way I think about it, Ruby, is that we got a 5-alarm fire of tens of thousands of people losing their homes, and the Supreme Court took a little garden hose and maybe at half strength kind of poured it on. That's not going to do it. It's good in theory, but I just don't think in reality it's going to help very many of the folks we talk with.
Oh, thank you so much. I want to also bring Tonda into this conversation because Tonda, if you could update our audience, there was at one point a mandatory eviction diversion program in Monroe County. Can you tell me what happened with that? Or tell all of us.
Certainly. So what we were, and as many of you recall, we were poised to be as flexible as we could be with the moratoria that had been out there. We were, we wanted to be prepared and have something in place should we not have gotten another extension of the moratorium. Because at that point, when renters that qualified that were no longer able to provide their landlord with a CDC declaration, there was no other safety net. And so we worked very hard working with the attorneys with our project and the mediators to come up with a way that they would get legal advice prior to going into any type of negotiation. And that was in place on August 2nd. What that was is you had, in order for a landlord or plaintiff to file an eviction notice, they had to provide an affidavit that showed that they had approached the tenant, that they had got information from the tenant on whether or not they applied for rental assistance. They got a status update on where that application was. The affidavit also had information on how to apply for rental assistance and whether or not the parties would be amenable to approaching mediation. If they had that affidavit signed, the tenant had to sign it, or the landlord would show that they attempted and it was not possible, or the tenant did not get back in touch with them. Then you could file an eviction case after 20 days had passed. So it automatically, one, informed the tenant that their landlord was looking to file eviction. It informed the tenant of options for rental assistance, and it created that opportunity for communication for the landlord property manager to see if there was a rental assistance application in there. And so it automatically kind of bought time and gave that information to the parties about rental assistance in order to get caught up with the arrears. Therefore, there's no need for that eviction for non-payment. And so we were almost a full month in, but there were some concerns. I think what the judge had mentioned, that concern came from Indianapolis court administration, that making that program mandatory might not hold up, and strongly suggested that the program be paused.
Yes, so that program was then paused in terms of the diversion court itself, or was it paused in terms of simply trying to mandate participation?
The actual requirement for having that affidavit was on pause. But we are fortunate here where we're in a county where we do have these options available. There is the landlord tenant task force recommendations, and the court's the state-sponsored facilitation program is there, but we have a mediation center that's been here, I believe, 20 to 25 years. That 2 years ago when we started our project, slightly over 2 years ago, we were offering that landlord-tenant mediation option through CJAM, and so we had already established some avenues that landlords and tenants could use to talk to each other. So we were fortunate that we have the center here in CJAM here in order to provide those opportunities, and had some recognition and already had a relationship with the courts. Not all counties, most counties don't have that option, and so we were fortunate.
Wonderful. We do have a question from our audience, and it helps us to segue very nicely into some of the voices that are missing from this conversation and the impacts on other folks, that are not involved, including our schools, including the impacts on our children. So I'll go ahead and ask this question on behalf of one member of our audience, and then we can certainly discuss it. But Mr. Macy asks, what kind of impact has this had on our children? What are the social costs of our failure to support stable housing? Excellent question. I want to thank you so much for that, sir. Any of you that would like to answer that question, I've got some thoughts, but certainly want to hear from each and every one of you who would like to answer. So, Fran, would you?
I think that's a Stephanie question.
All right,
like
Stephanie.
To the question that he asked, I don't know numbers exactly. I will say this, you said Mr. Macy's question, is there two parts to that question? Okay.
So yes, there were. What kind of impact has this had on infants and children? So I would imagine the impact of evictions, homelessness, or shelter insecurity. And it is a woman. Pardon me, Miss Macy.
Okay.
And what are the social costs of our failure to support stable housing?
So the first part,
the impact
that it has on our children, I think is really great. I can definitely attest to that. I have a young lady that I'm working with now, and when you look at those children who are being put out, I think it attests to their mental capacity and mental grounding. So it goes not only to the mental health of the child, but of the parent. And as far as the economic on the social determinant, I mean, I think it's priceless. I truly think it's priceless. You can't put a price tag on what it's doing, and I feel that the situation we have now warrants for our legislatures to be changed, and I am going to continue to fight for that so that we can have those things that we need for housing and having a stable environment to raise your children in.
Thank you so much. Fran, did you have something to add?
Just to underscore what Stephanie said, our experience in representing folks who are facing eviction. We were talking about it in class the other day with the students who represent the clients along with me. Almost every one of our clients, they're either sick or somebody in their family is sick. It seems like that there's a health issue, sometimes physical, sometimes mental health issue, that's already there, that's causing some of the struggles that are leading to them falling behind on rent. But to Stephanie's point, how could that be improved by the fact they don't know where they're going to live next week? I mean, it's clearly the data show that, as Stephanie said, but our experience, and as Stephanie's saying with folks she works with, I mean, this is just hugely traumatic to families, and that family pays a price, and we're all going to pay a price for what we're doing to these folks.
Until we are able to, like I said, change some of those laws, and beginning with not just beginning with housing, but looking at the living wage. I believe Tonda had mentioned something about $16 an hour. Even when I look at the calculations for $16 an hour, I truly don't see where that is making a livable wage for a family. You may be able to do it with one person, possibly two, but if I have a family, $16 an hour is not going to get it for my rent, my utilities, my car, my insurance, my food, my gas, my daycare. So once again, pay people what they're worth. I am definitely going to continue my lobbying so that we can increase the wage and make it where we can all live together and exist on the same level. I have, for many of my jobs, I know that I'm a good worker, excellent worker, go and do above and beyond. Those of us who do that, a lot of times we don't see extra income. You know, that extra mile that we've gone for you, we need to see that extra mile in return in some dollars so that we can take care of our families and our health so we can come back to the job the next day and do it all over again.
Wonderful, thank you. Tonda, I don't know if you had anything to add to that. There were points regarding what this means in terms of the cost for our children, for the cost for their education, those kinds of things.
Sure. Actually, I think with some numbers, the eviction lab data as of October 9th, there are 85,000 Indiana households behind in rent. Fran might have mentioned that earlier at the beginning. Of those 85,000 households that are behind in rent, it's 102,000 children in those households per eviction lab data. And so Ruby mentioned this, I think when we were chatting a little bit in the beginning. I mean, that's affecting our children, and there are, and not so if that's affecting them and their housing security, it affects their ability in school. It affects the way that they look at the world as they become adults. I know that personally, I'm talking to parents that are when they get evicted, or they know they're going to be evicted, and there isn't housing for them to move into, and there are wait lists at the shelters, and there's a wait list at the family shelter, and they can't get a voucher for temporary housing. They're worried about their children being taken away from them. That really does happen. If you if you're not able to provide stable housing, you run the risk of having your children not be with you. And we've had some women turn down assistance or shelter assistance because they're afraid that they'll be separated from their children. I don't know if that's something that any of you want to speak to, but we do get a lot of people that want the help and they need the help, but they're afraid. That help might even be there, but they're so afraid that their families are going to be torn apart even more, that they're not reaching out for some of those options that might be there for them.
Interesting. Thank you so much for that, Tonda. One of the things that I do wonder is whether and how much our school districts are brought into the process, how much they are at the table concerning the possible eviction of children. There is one school district that I know of, that Warren Consolidated, that works with the trustees there and with the judge there, and has created its own sort of eviction diversion court, where it works directly with parents to try to catch them before they're going into the system, help them with filing for IndyRent, which is also something I'm hoping we can talk about a bit more as well, is the IndyRent and the state as well as their ability to get those payments out to people. But one would think that because these are children, and that they do have, obviously, we have a stake in their future, whether it's their health care or juvenile justice issues or whatever, as taxpayers, we may very well end up paying down the line in other ways for some of the things that they end up experiencing because if they fall behind in school or what have you, some of the things that might end up happening with them. So I certainly would love to see it. And as we talk about solutions, if there is a way not to pull them in over their capacity, but if there is a way to make sure that our school districts to their availability are involved in helping to identify families that might need that help before they get into an eviction situation, that would be absolutely fantastic. I believe we do have another question from the audience on Facebook. We are going to be asked a question as soon as I call it up. All right, and take off my glasses so that I may see this question. Could you please advise the best way to proceed to those being evicted as a form of retaliation for reporting poor or inhabitable living conditions. Either Fran or Tonda, I'm going to guess this would go to you. What's the best way? Can you talk to us about what the law is, what rights you have as a tenant, the things you can do, the one thing perhaps you better not do in doing so. So please, Fran, and then Tonda, if you would add into that, that'd be wonderful.
Sure, and I'm sure Tonda will add to it, but that very question raises a really difficult challenge for us as advocates, and that is what the law we think is and what it really is in reality when folks go into court, especially because they usually go into court without a lawyer, without an advocate. So we think the law is that if you have poor conditions, and I say more than half of the folks we represent have some really poor conditions, front doors broken off, and folks are looting through their homes, that they have ceilings caved in, mold and rodents, etc. But the Indiana law on paper, we think, means that they could be able to withhold some of their rent because the conditions aren't meeting what's called in Indiana law warranty of habitability. Most judges across the state of Indiana don't agree with me. Hard to believe, right? But most judges don't agree with me, and they will say that no, you've got to pay all your rent even though the conditions are poor, and you can argue that in court on a later time. So unfortunately, the practical advice we give folks right now is that even when the conditions are poor, go ahead and pay all your rent, and you can proceed with something called a warranty of habitability counterclaim. You can use that as a defense to anything that the landlord might do later. But it sounds like that the questioner already is on step with. The first step usually is to call your local health department, because they should come out and do an inspection and issue a report, which will be a government agency saying, hey, landlord, you shouldn't have rodents here, you shouldn't have mold here, you shouldn't have major leaks and ceilings caved in, etc. And that does give sometimes tenants the chance to get some things fixed. The landlord should be ordered to do that. And if it does end up in court, that health department report is really valuable. So that's usually the step. Sounds like the person is worried about retaliation, which actually does happen, unfortunately, in reality. There should be, if that goes to court, there should be an argument that that's not appropriate. I don't have the ability to put it in the chat, but we partner with Indiana Legal Services. Our clinic and our law students the students do great work, but we have really limited capacity. We partner with Indiana Legal Services, which is statewide, has many housing attorneys, and I always encourage folks to go through. They have an online application. They also have phone calls that you can call in and apply to get assistance. There's some other agencies that do that too, but retaliatory eviction is a thing. It happens. It shouldn't happen, but there are legal rights there.
What about, I'm sorry about that, but when you say that, because on me being on the outside, making that phone call to you, what if I can't get in touch with anyone? What if I call the health department, and this is coming from somebody that I know personally had to do that because the living conditions they were in were bad, and yes, they wanted to say, well, I'm not going to pay my rent. No, you still got to pay your rent.
Yeah.
But okay, you're forcing me to continue paying my rent, but you're not doing anything about fixing my home. What else can I do after I call the health department? What if they come out and they say, okay, we need to fix this and this and this. I need to move. What can I get right now?
Yeah. So short term, and right now, Indiana doesn't have a good process for that, and we should. Other states and other jurisdictions have what they call it. You can go ahead and pay part of your rent into this escrow account,
and
not to your landlord,
okay,
and say, hey, I'm staying here, but I'm paying $200 this month, not to you, but to this escrow account, and if you want it, you go to court to say that I should pay it to you. And when we go to court, I'm going to talk about these conditions. That's what we should have. That's what Indiana needs to develop, and other places already do. It's one of the ways that we have poor landlord-tenant laws for the tenant perspective.
So another thing that I can go to the legislator so that we can
absolutely
change.
You need to.
Awesome.
You got a big list.
I got
of
a
things,
list.
Stephanie,
I got a
that
list.
You got to convince
I got a
our
list.
legislators to fix.
Okay.
Tonda, did you happen to have something to add to that? What if you are being evicted, or you believe you're being evicted in retaliation, do you have options? Are there suggestions that you might offer?
I really don't have more to add than other than what Fran said. If you wanted, I could put the information for Indiana Legal Services in the chat. We always encourage that people contact their intake line. I do know that with the amount, the sheer numbers of people that are facing eviction and needing legal advice, of course, they're prioritizing people in order to assist them to remain in their homes. But we run into that quite a bit where tenants are a little shocked and to find out that warranty of habitability is not something that pertains to them here. We do have a lot of people that move to Bloomington or are here temporarily from other states, and they're very surprised when there is a 10-day notice to quit, or when they don't have the same rights that they would have in their home states.
Thank you, Tanda. I do want to talk a bit about, if we could, the efforts by the state and the city to distribute the funding that the federal government gave for rental assistance. Let's start with the state, if we might. How are they doing in your assessment, Fran, in distributing the funding that they've received?
So my day job is I'm a professor, I'm a teacher. I'll hand out grades. An absolute F. It's been a huge failure by the state of Indiana in particular, which we have had hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government sent to the state of Indiana specifically to keep people in their homes. We've got tens of thousands of people who are at risk of eviction because they're behind on their rent, and that money's not getting there. The money is not getting there. Now, I got to say, the folks who are doing the work in these particular agencies, that's true at the city level as well, as far as I can ever see, they're doing really hard work. But there needs to be about 10 times more of them. And they need to have much more outreach. We still have people who come into court don't know anything about the program. They certainly struggle to apply for it. They struggle to figure out what's going on. And the way I think of it, Ruby, is you think of the fact that we've got hundreds of millions of dollars available to keep people in their homes. We're still evicting them because the money's not getting to them. I think of our governor. Frankly, if these were people in Geist or people in Hamilton County who are at risk of losing their homes and there was money there to help them, he'd be going door to door with envelopes of cash, right?
Well, maybe that's what we need to do.
That's
Go
exactly
door to door and say, hey, how are you doing?
Absolutely, it's what we need. We absolutely should do it. And to be honest, he's not doing it. He's not prioritizing it. That's true at the state level. And I think our city should, the city does much better, but it can do much better because it needs more and more folks, more and more outreach. And again, let's not ignore the fact of who's getting evicted. Very disproportionately black and brown folks, very disproportionately black women with children. That's by far the biggest demographic of who's getting evicted. Those folks are not being prioritized. That's probably not a surprise when we look at Indiana's history and this nation's history. And it's a huge missed opportunity and tragedy. People are losing their homes that shouldn't.
Tanda, how are you finding the experience with folks in applying for state assistance?
So our program, we are not being in a municipality. Our program is different than Marion County, so it's not Indy Rent. My experience is that I'm talking to people that have confirmations that they have been applied and they have been approved, and they are still getting evicted. I have talked to people that have a payment that was deposited in their landlord's bank account. They have a screenshot of a text message that shows that that payment was made and the date that it was made. And because that landlord said that they didn't have that cash in hand, they were still evicted. We had a woman that was in a mediated agreement in order to pay by a certain date. She got the rental assistant disbursement confirmation the day before her deadline date, provided that information to the property manager. It was a dual payee check that was being issued. She got evicted. And then after she was not out by a specified time, the sheriff was called on her, and she was escorted out. And then the property manager had her car towed because she was no longer there. She then was an unauthorized guest. That happens all the time. It is so hard to see, especially for somebody that did everything that they were told to do. They went to their job was no longer there. They applied for the assistance, they sent in their documents, and it might have been very difficult for them. Not everybody has a smartphone or a cell phone, or they can scan a PDF, or they are literate. We make this assumption, I think, that some of the things that we take for granted, that they're easier for people to do. And I'm talking to people that are trying to access a hearing on Zoom, and they don't know how to do that, and there's not an advocate there. They're told to call 211. It's awful. That woman got her check in the mail for something like $7,000 that would have covered her rental arrears, her 1 month forward-facing rent, and she's out in the street and her locked out of her furniture because the property managers had that information and didn't have the money in hand. It's awful. I know I'm yelling. I'm so angry. Usually at this time I start to burst into tears because these are people that are trying their hardest. It's not like it's somebody that's not putting forth the effort. Maybe they're overwhelmed and they're not sure where to start, but they are trying very hard to do whatever it is that they're doing, and all they want is to work and make that money to be able to pay 60% of their earnings in order to have a roof over their head for a place that doesn't have hot water. It's I'm getting heated and I'm gonna stop talking now.
Okay, Sandra, why don't I segue?
It's very hard to see. I was in court today. We were in court, and I have an intake, and a woman that I was so hoping would call, I hadn't heard from her. She no longer had minutes on her phone. She is approaching her 70th birthday, and she's living in her storage unit. This is not. We can't continue if we can't provide for our most vulnerable people. What are we doing? I am going to stop now.
No, okay. And it would seem to be especially tragic since the funds are there. If I'm understanding everyone correctly, the funds are there. The money is there. And that is what is so absolutely frustrating about it. I was in a meeting yesterday with a group of other media members with the mayor, and they talked a lot about IndyRent. It seems like they've made a lot of improvements there. They are now giving out the $91 million that they received from the state as well. They've expanded the amount of money you can get. Before it was simply 1 to 3 months of rent, and now they've expanded that to 12 months. So there seems to be progress there. What hurts so much for me at least is to see that there are people who will fall along the wayside before they can get that assistance, and so much as Tanda is saying, people who've really done everything that they possibly can to make sure that they keep a roof over their heads and the heads of their families. So thank you so much for that, Tanda. I appreciate that. I do want to talk a bit about solutions. Certainly one of the solutions is get money to folks faster. Of course. But I do want to talk to each of you about, solutions that we could bring to the table about this current situation and how to, hopefully prevent this, or to at least, really save this off in the future. And Fran, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, you look at public opinion polls, and you see, Ruby, that the majority of us believe that there's a human right to housing, that the majority of us believe that the government should be involved in guaranteeing that human right to housing. So it's not a surprise I do some teaching about multi-faith arguments for human rights, and so all of our faith traditions and moral traditions say that this is an outrage. This is outrage in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, what have you, that we have families who are losing their homes. So if we think there's a human right to housing, why are we doing things the way we are? There's a couple things we do wrong. One is that we take a human right and we hand it over to for-profit corporations for the most part. The Star did a terrific investigation about most of the folks getting evicted in Marion County and Indianapolis are getting evicted by corporate landlords. Why would we say if this is a human right, but folks can only have that human right if it's going to make enough money for someone else to pay their shareholders and pay big CEO salaries? And we have landlords on the other side of our cases, and they can be contentious, but I got to say, they say something right when they're evicting someone and they say, wow, I'm really sorry that your client is going to have to sleep in a car or going to have to go, find some place to be downtown. But it's not my responsibility. And they're right. It's not their responsibility. It's my responsibility. It's our responsibility. If we have a human right to housing, so what do? We have 3 out of every 4 people who are eligible for these vouchers, which really are life changers, and we say no to them because we don't have enough of them. And it's not because we don't spend money on housing. We do spend money on housing. We spend money on housing for people who get mortgage interest tax deduction. That's our biggest housing expenditure. That's for really wealthy people for the most part. That's who uses it. Corporate landlords get hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks. We spend money on housing. We just don't spend money on housing for folks who need it. And that's a fundamental big picture change which has to happen. But it can start with our local communities at the state level, when Stephanie convinces the General Assembly to completely change their perspective on housing, and of course at the federal level. But we talk a good game about being a human right to housing, and we absolutely get an F in terms of fulfilling that.
Stephanie?
I agree with you 100%, Fran, and that is something that needs to be addressed once again on my list with the legislators. But what I look at, another way of getting the housing solution, partnering with our communities, which I do now, and being a member of Broadway United Methodist, working with the Maternal Child Health Initiative. It's rewarding, and my solution is taking some of that community partnerships, getting low-income housing together with maybe health centers, schools, collaborating so that we have lots of buildings that are not being used, that could be renovated, that could be remodeled. We have lots of community activists who own properties in our communities but are not using some of their buildings to, I think, the fullest potential to help us in the community, Black women, single moms, to be able to meet our need. That solution of housing, I mean, I've heard people talk about tiny housing. Yeah, you can do tiny housing, but why not take what we already have? There's so much blight in Indianapolis. Take what we have, make it affordable, and not just affordable, because you still got to increase my pay so that I can afford it, but I need the amenities that come along with that. I don't want the rats, I don't want the roaches, I want nice housing. Everybody wants nice housing to be able to make it better for our children. And then when we talk about, and I'm going to go into a different section, our children getting out here and the crime rate, you don't think that may have been a cause from what we didn't do to house these people, so now their mental health is not in the right frame of mind, so what am I going to do? And we put too many of our people in that what am I going to do position. And so with that, at the state level, I think they need to help more with taking care of the people in our community. And I think, like I said, some of the community collaboratives would be really helpful. We just take care of one another.
One of the points that you mentioned, though, Fran, I wanted to follow up with you on just about one question that had to do with whether folks are obligated to provide, whether we in any way provide apologies, that we in any way require, say, developers to develop X amount of affordable housing. Is that something that we do, or that we can? Well, I guess we could, but is that something that's done here in the fine state of Indiana?
In the fine state of Indiana, we do what every other state does, and we have low-income housing tax credits, which is a really big source of affordable housing. They can be much better. Low-income housing tax credits are very much sought after by developers. It's a really good financial deal for them. And in return for getting these tax credits, they have to promise that a certain number of units in the new development are going to be affordable for lower income folks for a period of time. But to be honest with you, the way that we calibrate who gets those tax credits is much more right now in the interest of the developers than the folks who need housing. Other states have done a better job of making sure that those tax credits work, and developers are compelled, if they want these breaks that we give, government, we the people with our tax dollar breaks, if they want those breaks, they're going to have to do better. And that's one of the ways, I think, as advocates, one of the ways our clinic is looking into doing a better job of making sure that when those tax credits are handed out, that the families we're talking about here are prioritized. To some of your point I mentioned about who's not in the room, the Supreme Court Landlord-Tenant Task Force, which recommended these changes you mentioned, Stephanie and I were mentioning before we went on the air. It's got a lot of folks who are on that commission. You've been a part of that, talking with folks on it. There's not any tenants on there. there's not any folks who are former tenants. There's not any folks like Stephanie who's faced eviction. Why? It's a, there's plenty of judges. I think that we could supplement that, the folks who are at the table making these decisions, with folks who've lived it. And I think if we did that, then the outcomes would be better.
All right, thank you so much. And Tanda, are there things that you would advocate that we should try to do, things that we're missing from your perspective in terms of ways to mitigate this?
I'd say that, again, kind of bringing it in a little bit more, is we're focusing on outreach and marketing of the Indiana Emergency Rental Assistance Program. I mean, right now, in our county and the other counties that don't have their own, the disbursement of those funds are keeping people housed. Talking with the facilitators of the program, seeing ways that we can educate those that are applying to have all their documentation, creating a kiosk and a service area at the City Hall. We're working with our county librarians to make sure that there are dedicated computers and staff to be able to help someone that aren't able to scan and get that PDF and check their email. So that way we're providing one-on-one assistance to get that application in, and then the follow-up that's required. Because without eviction expungement here in Indiana, being able to get those funds, pay off the arrears, get a satisfaction of judgment is really the closest that we can come that eviction is going to show up, whether someone was evicted or not, whether it was it was immediately dismissed. But if there's a money judgment, having that judgment paid, having the satisfaction of judgment there, helping the tenant navigate the court system if they already have a case filed, is really what our focus is for our project. I just think that that the more that we can support people that are having those challenges and get the word out, the better off we're going to be. One of the hopeful parts of the pre-eviction diversion program is it is voluntary, and if you choose to go in that case is sealed. If you participate in the state's program, in that program, then that is the closest that you can come to having those records not there. And maybe Fran is a little bit more eloquent in being able to explain that. But that's what we're focusing on. And we're fortunate that we have the Monroe County Apartment Association. We have our Board of Realtors. They are putting together a program along with IERA for the landlords and property managers and realtors to encourage them to get that information to their tenants, to encourage them to participate in the state's program and provide the documents as needed. And so that's been our approach right now, is to focus on marketing and outreach of the funds.
Wonderful, thank you. In the few moments that we have left, Fran, and you too as well, Tanda, and certainly Stephanie, if you'd like to weigh in on this, but what would be the benefit to a landlord? Are there ways that we might be able to show the landlord that there is a benefit in participating in a diversion program? We know that the benefit would be there for the tenant, right? But what might the benefit be for the landlord as well? Would you be able to keep a good tenant? Might you, what might some of those benefits be?
I think there's significant benefits to the landlord to keeping those folks in, right? That there's in that keeping the folks in who they know are good tenants and who they know the emergency rental assistance, although it's been shamefully slow coming through, it has come through, it will come through, and they know they can count on that money on the back end. The hard part is that a diversion by its name means something different than the current court system. When we make the current court system just such a slam dunk for landlords, they don't have a lot of motivation to opt out of that. So I think it's courts are not shy about giving orders. I can tell you that after many years as a lawyer, they'll give orders when they want to. I think this is a case where the court is going to have to order the landlords to do it. And I got to say, it's not just me saying this. Landlords and landlords attorneys are saying this as well. Why would we participate if we don't have to? I think we need to make it so that they have to.
All right, Tanda, any thoughts on that?
I would just support what Fran's saying. I think that again, we're smaller. I guess, not as large as some of the other cities out there. It's, I mean, you have to look in the mirror and know you're kicking somebody out, and you're not meeting that. You're not meeting that the ethics, and I am having trouble because I'm so passionate about this that I'm not articulating it very well.
Earlier, Tonda, you did mention that it can be advantageous to keep a tenant who really wants to pay you back, might give you a bit more of leeway in terms of saying, yes, this person has promised to pay X amount per month. They might have a better opportunity to actually see that money that's been promised,
right?
Versus putting someone out. So I do so appreciate your thoughts, and you are extraordinarily eloquent, so don't worry about that.
I appreciate that. I think it can be a quicker resolution. You're not waiting for the court to be filed. You're not waiting for the case to be filed. The case to be filed with the court. You can have that communication. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I know we are running out of time, but Stephanie, before we go, I did want to give you an opportunity to talk just a little bit about some of the other suggestions that you might have. Earlier, you mentioned that there is a benevolence fund that one organization is starting. So perhaps you could share a bit of information about that with folks.
Real quick, I am a member of the board for the Raphael Health Center, and they are very beginning of a benevolence fund, and this is going to be a fund that will allow people in need of being evicted. They will get rental assistance. However, there are going to be requirements. I will just say at this point, it's going to be starting with the Raphael Health Center, and if anyone is wanting information, I'll have them to maybe contact you and you can let me know. But it appears to be something that I think is going to be good for the community and the neighborhood. Like I said, it's a fund that I'm hoping that we can even get people to donate to increase this fund so that we can help those who really need it.
All right, thank you so much. Well, it is close to 5 p.m. I'm not sure how much time that we have left, but certainly want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon and for the conversation about evictions. I certainly hope that we are able as a community to come together and really figure out a way to make sure that people have the most basic fundamental housing, right? That they can be safe, secure, able to afford their housing, and able to, to live there and be productive citizens, certainly, of our great state. So for all of us, for Fran and for Stephanie, for Tonda, we thank you here at the Indianapolis Star so much for joining us and for being a part of today's discussion. Have a great evening.